What about the language coming to an end? So you say, well, people don't no longer speak Babylonian. So the commentators ask, this is the year 1100. People still speak Babylonian. So if they still speak Babylonian, that part of the prophecy was never fulfilled. But the Talmud says it came to an end. Where did it come to an end? So
okay. So if that prophecy never became fulfilled, okay, it never came about, then there's a problem there, isn't there? Okay, there's the truth then that a lot of the prophecies made didn't come true. You understand? Okay, so we're trying to figure out who this king was. Was it Nimrod or was it somebody else prior to him? Because Nimrod became powerful, etc., etc., according to the Bible. Apparently he had a wife, but Nimrod died, and she was found to be pregnant, or she was boasting that she was pregnant. So the story goes, as far as we know, that it's the reincarnation of Nimrod, and this went on to become possibly the Horus Osiris, related to that, right? That her husband was, or that king was killed by his brother Set, or something like that, thrown into the Nile where the crocodiles ate all of them, but she managed to grab the pieces, put it back together, but she couldn't find his phallus, so she created this wooden one, all that sort of stuff, and then apparently had a child to him and all this sort of stuff, which was the horse or something like that, right? As far as those myths go, all that sort of stuff. It sounds very relatable to Nimrod, maybe Semiramis or whoever his wife was, okay? But she did apparently boast that she had this child, she was pregnant to that dead king, and he was the reincarnation of Nimrod. So we'll carry on.
One of the commentators answers that it's not referring to the Babylonian language, but rather it's referring to, there was a dialect that was spoken only by the royalty of Babylon. That dialect will become forgotten, but the language remains in place, the vernacular which the commoner speaks.
It's a modern language, it's a modern derivative of it, right?
That language will continue to be spoken. However,
or a new version of that old language, right? That one died, but there was a new one that came along, and the people, common people, everyday people spoke that one.
The Maharal of Prague explains it differently. He explains, he says, if a Persian speaks Babylonian, does that make him a Babylonian? He speaks the language. What is language? Language is a representation of a culture. That's what language is. The Persians have their culture, however, it's expressed through the Persian language. The Babylonians have their unique culture.
That should be the Babylonians, not the Labylonians. It sounds like an Italian sausage.
It's expressed through Babylonian. The French have their culture. They express it through French. The English, the British have theirs. It's expressed through English language. So what is language? Language is an expression of the profile of that particular group. Whether you're Frenchman, Englishman, we're talking about, it's a different personality. It's a different perspective. When people have two perspectives, you can't have meetings in the mind. The French and the English can never see eye to eye. Why can't they see eye to eye? Because they speak different language, or because the whole mentality, the perspectives is different perspective. So language is only indication the perspective is different perspective.
Could that also be why males can never truly understand the female mind, because it's completely different? Could it be something like that, along those lines? Who knows?
Well, God disrupted this project, this rebellion, this mutiny against him, when he created 70 languages. The language is only an indication of the perspective, became a different perspective. Initially, when they spoke the same language, that indicated they had a similar, almost identical perspective. We all have a meeting in the minds because we see things similarly. But now,
that's when you're one in agreement, right? You're communicating. Okay, you got the same mindset or understanding, right? You're agreeing with each other. Is that what it's referring to?
that God gave each one another language, and language is an expression of that ethnic group or that culture, we see things differently. We can't agree on anything. As a result of that, when it says one asked for this, one asked for that, they became frustrated. They started to kill one another. It's not because they couldn't communicate. They could communicate. But the communication initially, which was embraced and valued, they can't agree on anything. Because they couldn't agree on anything. And what was the proof that their perspective changed is because each one had his own language.
Isn't that because of division that was created, that separation, that differentiation, or that differentiation, or that difference, i.e. they were given different languages, so this one could no longer understand what that one was saying. As he said, pass the bucket, this guy goes and gives him a hammer. Right? No, he said, I said bucket, and he gives him a hammer, right? Or gives him a shovel. So the guy gets frustrated, grabs the shovel and smacks him on the head with it. Is that what he's trying to get at?
Language is an expression of the perspective of the culture. That's the understanding.
But like cultures, language evolves over time. So that's possibly why they end up losing the old language, right? It dies out, and then but they create this, or manage to create this modern vernacular, or this new vernacular of it, right? And speak that new language.
So initially, so that is the meaning, what the prophet said, that because he destroyed the temple, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, the language will be forgotten. Meaning that perspective, which represents the Babylonian perspective, will come to an end. That perspective that will no longer exist. So anybody who speaks Babylonian, it's no longer expressing the Babylonian perspective, but rather it's a Persian perspective expressed through the Babylonian language. It's like if a person speaks Farsi, it doesn't make him into a Persian. He could be an American, except he's bilingual, trilingual, how many languages he knows. He speaks the language, but that has nothing to do with who he himself is. So according to this principle, when God originally created the world, I was saying the Hebrew language is called Lashon HaKodesh. It's the Hebrew tongue.
Ignore that, Los Angeles. It's a silly subtitles putting up the wrong. Hears it wrong, so it puts up the wrong words. Nothing to do with Los Angeles. He's talking about the Lashon HaKodesh.
Because it's God's language. So if all humanity initially, before there was this presentation of languages, which disrupted the unity with the Tower of Babel, what does that mean? If they all spoke the same language. All speaking the same language means they have a similar perspective. So if all humanity spoke the Hebrew language, the holy tongue, what does that mean? That means that perspective is rooted in some degree of holiness. Because if language is an expression of God, and that displays some aspect of God's godliness, so if man speaks that language, what is primary in that person? It's his godliness. It's his soul, which initially was the intention of creation. So
in some, it would be like the purity of that language, right? Coming through these people, they'd like be in agreement. They wouldn't be like dissing each other, smacking each other on the head with shovels and stuff like that at that point. They're all in agreement because they're all united. Okay, there's no division yet. Okay, no other languages given them to cause confusion or make them speak in babble, right? Okay. So yeah, all intentions would have been good. Is that what he's saying? Like he might the guy might say, "Can you pass the hammer, please?" So he goes, "Oh, sure, brother." He gives him the hammer. And now the guy goes, "Thank you very much. You're so kind." Talk like that, right? Because they all had these one mind, one consciousness, and it was all pure holiness, etc. Is that what he's getting at?
Of the tree of knowledge, what was the thrust of his value? The thrust of his value was his spirituality, because he went and ingested the tree of knowledge, the fruit, which is unadulterated evil, he became totally confused and diminished and limited. But he still spoke the language. So all humanity still spoke the language. That means they still had that spark of holiness within them, and therefore the perspective was similar. They may have been off, but the perspective there's still relevance to understanding who God is. Whether they want to submit to him, that's a different story. Submit is a different issue.
Okay, so it continues on from there. So we are going to compare this Lashon HaKodesh with the Aramaic translator Victor Alexander's translation of the original language that God spoke, the Lshana Ateeqa of the Ktav Ivri. We're going to have a look at that. Okay, and his notes on it from his website. We actually found this, some really interesting stuff before that. Okay, we just got to find it again. Okay, here it says the Asherai were moreover Aramaic-speaking Semites, and barriers of race and language were virtually non-existent between them and their Jewish brethren in the Holy City. The Asherai naturally gravitated to the eastern side, and so forth. Okay, that was something that we found interesting. Okay, yeah, maybe that was just it. Okay, we can't remember if there's anything else here that we found of interest. Probably should have highlighted it. As we said in other videos, as pathetic as it sounds, most Asherai do not know or recognise their own extensive history. There's even a strange mistrust of Asherai scholars. Anyone who writes on their history from amongst their nation at one time or another is accused of selling out the people, right? Okay, yeah, because we came across a Assyrian, very nice, and he said to us they don't like talking about their history. When we asked, can you tell us about your Assyrian history? He says, no, we hate our history, we don't like it, and he didn't want to talk about it, right? Okay. Maybe also because other people would jump on it and start throwing crap at it, or whatever reasons he had. Okay, so we left that alone, and we're still trying to seek people who will actually do that. But if they don't like to talk about their history, well, you can't force them, to do that for you. Okay. Trying to find anything else on here that jumped out at us. Okay. Okay, here's the thing about the Asherai Church. The Church of the East goes back to the time of our Lord Jesus Christ. One of the last kings of an Asherai city-state during the Christian era, King Abgar, sent for Jesus to come to a city to cure him of leprosy. Jesus, as said, replied of his inability to go to him personally, but later sent two of his disciples to cure the king of his affliction. So his king or his son. Yeah, there's two versions of this apparently. It was his son that had some leprosy or whatever, and he wanted him healed. When this was accomplished, the king ordered his entire kingdom to convert to Christianity. The Church of the East still commemorates this event in its liturgy. Okay? And there's a lot of people out there, theologians, etc., that say, this letter doesn't exist. Or it does, but there's very little of it, or some other person has made a note of it in their history. They're telling of the history, and they speak about this King Abgar, the Black, probably of Edessa. Okay, it's talking about Henry Layard that discovered the Great Library of Nineveh, an archaeological dig. Him and his assistant, Razam or something like that, right? And shipped 50,000 tablets to the British Museum. They're sitting there today. Okay. However, Asherai have been known as Nestorians, Chaldeans, Nestorian Chaldeans, as Layard calls them, occasionally dropping the designation of Nestorian. East Syrian, as Aziz is Atiya, refers to them sometimes as Syriac-speaking or Aramaic-speaking people. Surayah, as sometimes the Asherai themselves call each other, succumbing to the confusion which has been created as a result of various political theories, policies, or histories concerned with the many religious designations of the Asherai nation. Because Nestorian, they're erroneously called the Nestorian Church because Nestorius had a debate with Cyril, a Roman Catholic, and he said that he came up with the hypostasis. Right? He said that Jesus, or the Christ, was of two substances, two natures, both divine and man. Cyril didn't like this, and he was jealous because he wanted to be the bishop of all bishops, but he felt that Nestorius would be, right? So he started creating all these lies about him. And then they were called, because this church agreed with that hypostasis that he had, story that he came out with, right? Of Christ having two substances, or being of two natures, both God or divine and man. Because they said, they later on, that they had been saying that, or believed that, whatever, thousands of years before Nestorius uttered it, they were labelled Nestorians. The Nestorian Church erroneously, okay, to a point where someone in an interview with the Patriarch kept saying Nestorian, Nestorian, Nestorian. So he says, look, if you keep saying Nestorian, we're going to have to go to war. But they've basically taken it on and accepted it because that's the title that was bestowed upon him, even though it was erroneous. He's not the founder of their church. Okay, so they got persecutions, called heretics, for 18 centuries or 2,000 years of crap, right, by the Roman Catholics, probably the Protestants, Tamerlane, Genghis Khan and the Mongols, ISIS, the Kurds, Al-Qaeda, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to go to the next one because we can't see what jumped out at us earlier. Anything else there? Yeah, and further translator notes, this is Victor N. Alexander, translator from Bet Naharain, or Mesopotamia, Syria, with 15 years experience. And he states one of the early ideas he had regarding the translation of the Bible was to avoid reading the existing Bible translations thoroughly before translating. He did not wish the translations from the Greek or Latin verses to influence him. He wanted a fresh impression as much as was possible. He attempted to suppress the wordings and phraseology that had crept into his subconscious. He had to guard against unconscious inclusions of wordings from other translations. Having attended many church services since childhood, and his reading of the Bible over the years could make his translation a difficult task. One of the mistakes that he made at the very beginning was assuming that the Syriac translation of the Peshitta, that would be the Eastern Syriac Peshitta, was an authentic work of translating. This misconception set him back about a year and a half. At first the mistake depressed him, but later it turned out to be an unexpected benefit. He became familiar with the evolution of the Aramaic language. He had already translated the Gospels of Mark and Matthew in that order. Then he had a conversation one day with an old Church of the East priest. He told him that Victor N. Alexander, that had been translating the Bible from Syriac, Victor N. Alexander had told this high priest that he had been translating the Bible from Syriac into English for the sake of sharing the authentic Aramaic Bible with his American friends and English-speaking people. At this time he did not say very much except for smiling what he thought was approval. At a later meeting, the high priest asked him what he was doing. He said that he was still translating the Bible. Then the high priest had to tell him, Victor N. Alexander, he said, the Syriac is all wrong. Talk about being shocked. Victor N. Alexander had just finished translating Matthew and was getting ready to translate John. He had already translated Mark before he met the high priest that priest for the first time from that original apostolic Church of the East. He asked him, this is Victor N. Alexander asking that priest, wasn't the Syriac translated from the ancient tongue? The Church of the East is an Asherai church. And we do not use the term Aramaic. They don't refer to themselves as Assyrian, but Ashur. And we do not use the term Aramaic. This is a Western designation, or name allocated to it, right? Aramaic really evolved from the language of the Ashurite, the people of Mesopotamia. This priest said, no, the Syriac version was translated by the Protestants and Catholics from the Greek versions. Then Victor N. Alexander asked him, still incredulous, you mean no one has translated the ancient tongue original at all? The priest said no. Then he purchased a copy of the official Church of the East New Testament book from him, and he began reading Mark and later Matthew, and he was amazed it was different. And that's why when you look at on YouTube at Victor N. Alexander's explanation of his translation of the original Aramaic Brita, or known as Genesis in English, you'll find that he's reading from what looks like a Bible in a funny language, right? That's that Aramaic, possibly the Ninevite Aramaic, because he's used a method to revive that old dead language, and he's speaking that, he's reading to you and translating it into English for all his viewers. Okay, that's the one he's talking about, that he got from the high priest, right? Okay, it's erroneously called Adam, or wrongly called Adam and Eve, but it should be Adam and Eve. Yeah. We'll just put in the Aramaic scriptures in your YouTube search, and you'll find it. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. So that's that native-born Aramaic-speaking translator from Mesopotamia, Syria. 15 years experience in translating those particular scriptures, Victor N. Alexander. His middle name is Nimrod, not Isaac, as one person, Bennett, on his blog site tried to say that he said. Could have been hospitalized at the time and made a mistake, but I doubt it, because throughout his website he stresses that his grandfather or great-grandfather or someone was in his family was called Nimrod, so that's his middle name, and they can trace it back to the actual Nimrod of the Bible, as well as the Jews that came out of Exodus, right? They were liberated from Egypt, etc. So he can trace that, apparently. Okay, so this was all these scriptures weren't translated from the ancient tongue originally, right? So this high priest, or this priest, said no. So he purchased a copy of the official Church of the East New Testament book from him, and he began reading Mark and later Matthew. He was amazed it was different, and he started to retranslate it, right? It took him a while to recover emotionally. He had spent 1.5 years of his time translating the two Gospels from what he thought was the authentic Aramaic transcription into modern Syriac. Then he found out that he had been translating from a 19th century Syriac translation of what he finally determined was really a Syriac translation of mostly an English version. This 1897 Syriac version that he had was translated in Urmi, Iran, by American and English missionaries with the help of proselytized Ashurite Christians, because they went in there, right, with their King James and converted a lot of these people to their form of Western Christianity, right? So they became Christians, but what they tried to do was to try to translate that King James version into Syriac, as we mentioned in other videos, and they totally messed it up. They botched it, right? So Victor N. Alexander studied the work and activities of the missionaries to Urmi from around about 1839. He made some interesting discoveries. The Church of the East, being impoverished and its people barely surviving under Islamic oppression of the crumbling Ottoman Empire, had allowed the missionaries to enter their villages in North Iran and southwest Turkey. They preached to them their modern religions, their Western Christianity, their pseudo-Christianity. The missionaries from the West came in and established schools and churches and medical facilities. That's what they do when they see that need. That's what they do. Okay, that's what the Seventh-day Adventists are all about as well. Their movement, providing those hospital, medical facilities and churches. Here they have a business that's run by them, owned by them, by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, called, I think they call it here, Sanitarium. They do cornflakes and all that sort of stuff, right? After that guy who, I've forgotten his name, but it might have been Kellogg. Yeah, that was his name, Kellogg. They might be doing Kellogg cornflakes or some similar type of cornflake, right? Because my stepfather went there to get a job, and he ended up walking out and throwing their job application form in the rubbish, because they first said, "Oh, you are Seventh-day Adventist," and he's a proud Englishman, right? Church of England, me, mate, all that sort of stuff. And then they asked him, he reckons they asked him some questions on the form. When's the last time did you have sex? You involved yourself in a sexual activity? And he says, I just walked out and chucked it in the rubbish, and he got another job somewhere else in a warehouse, working for a warehouse, a popular warehouse here. Right? That guy had so much talent, skill, mouth-wise, that he could quit one job and go and work in the job next door, in the business next door. That's how talented he was. That's why I admired him for that. Okay, because he had that ability to do that. Okay, the missionaries from the West came in and established schools and churches and medical facilities. They learned the Syriac Aramaic vernacular, a modern version of it, right? And wrote up a grammar for the people. As a result, everyone could now read the Bible in the modern vernacular, which until then only priests of the Church of the East knew how to read. The ancient Aramaic scripture was passed down to them from the apostolic age. So all these people out there that boast, "Oh, I know it better than him," when he says the Lord's Prayer, he says Avun or Abun or something. That's all wrong. He doesn't know. I know it because I went to a biblical college or institution or whatever, and I got this pretty little certificate that says I'm an expert, right? Go figure. You can speak it better than a guy who speaks it fluently? Wow, you're an Einstein. Okay, the Church of the East had retained the ancient Aramaic in their liturgy when celebrating Mass and conducting official church services. The Bible itself was read in the original ancient Aramaic during church services. The priests explained it to them in their modern Aramaic vernacular, probably that Syriac or whatever, right? Through brief sermons. By this date, there were no major theologians left. So, with the originals, they didn't have to translate it and translate it into other foreign languages like Greek, Latin, or whatever, right? Because it was basically for the people who spoke the same language. They understood it, they wrote it, whatever, right? Who attended their mass or their church, right? So these high priests or these priests, they just read it to them, right? Explained it to them, and they grasped it. See, there were no major Asherai or Assyrian Church of the East theologians left. In comparison, the Catholic Church has always had priests that knew Latin. The Church of the East priests of this period did not know ancient Aramaic that well. However, the Catholic Latin version was a translation of the Greek, which is itself by definition a translation of the words of Jesus Christ spoken in ancient Aramaic. So what these Catholics have got is a Latinized version of the Greek. In contrast, the Church of the East at least had the original ancient Aramaic scriptures hand copied without any changes from the original tongue. Judging by the thousands of idioms that only make complete sense in the Aramaic, there is no doubt as to the origin of the ancient Aramaic New Testament. The Church of the East ancient Aramaic New Testament is the original gospel of Jesus Christ. All others are translations. The Church of the East schools, etc., etc. And there's more here. He decided to carry on his translation independently of all denominations. The ecumenical movement is somewhat responsible for a superficial solidarity among the denominations involved with it. The established churches do not see any need for a new English language translation. Okay, he resumed his work with his translation after all those considerations. Okay, he's got some more there. And there's the reason why he's not used the Logos as Andrew Gabriel Roth has in his translation of the Eastern Syriac Peshitta into English at the AramaicScriptures.com. Okay, he hasn't used the Greek word Logos or the word in English. Okay. He opened up John and started reading the ancient Aramaic of this gospel for the first time, and he was awed by it. Here was a clear view of the triune God from the very beginning of the first chapter. The key word was milta, a beautiful word in its theological connotation, and there was no English equivalent for it, so they had to run around and find one in the English that matched it, right? That fit it. Logos and word are such poor substitutes. There is essentially no English translation for the word milta, as we just stated, in a theological sense. Therefore, he had to come up with one. So he translated the word milta as manifestation. Jesus Christ is God manifest, God incarnated in the flesh, right? There is one God. But, or yet, there are three manifestations, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's what makes it triune. There's a difference between the triune of the Mesopotamian, that concept, etc., right, and its meaning, and the Christian understanding of their Trinity, which comes from supposedly a Roman or someone like that called Tertullian. Okay, he had this idea of the Trinity. So there's a difference here. Someone the other day, a Christian, said no, it didn't come from him. Go do your research to find out where that Christian concept, the Trinity, comes from, right? Okay, so Victor N. Alexander translated John and then Luke, and then finally went back to Matthew and started fresh, and then at that point he's translating Mark. And you see, he kept posting translations until he has all the New Testament down pat. Then he would start with the Old Testament. He never completed the whole lot because he, being an older man, he had some medical problems and all that sort of stuff. But hopefully he's alright now. As far as we know, he came out of the hospital after 56 days, and that's all we know.